Hi, it's Kirby Summers. Today is January 2nd, 2025. It is Thursday, and we're into it. We're into the new year. I'd love to hear how your new year has started out. I hope it has started out really well and that you push forward in a positive way, make your life easier, come from a place of strength. I uploaded a podcast yesterday on my Patreon about sort of like unknown pieces of history. And I did the same thing. I basically told my patrons that the way that I live my life is I stand from a position of power only because I undertook a journey in trying to uncover the truth. In my case, I thought initially it was just a truth meant solely for me to discover reasons why there were forces that wanted me to be unalived. And eventually that turned into what I do now, which is delve into the nooks and crannies of truths that aren't mainstream. You will not really hear about, you may not even know about things. And that's given me the strength and the conviction and the sort of the overall, well, like there's this feeling, although I still get trolled and I still get threats, and that will continue forever. The fact that I am more aware basically have made it my mission to uncover things that were not visible to me has made me stronger. And I believe that that adage, knowledge is power, can be used by us individually to stand in a place of freedom. Because although knowledge is power, knowledge is also freedom. And so I encourage you to live your best life. Yes, absorb the truth, learn to decode the truth, learn that you can't go to Wikipedia, for example. I have one or two people who tend to go to Wikipedia and cite things, and it's annoying, because Wikipedia is not your place of truth, your fountain of truth. Uh, that said, not everyone is a Wikipedia junkie or sprouts back wiki facts or misrepresentations. And so I encourage you to just go into this new year from a position of strength based on the fact that you have taken it upon yourselves to learn the truth. And today's subject is going to be on Edie Sedgwick. And it is not the sort of podcast that other people have done on Edie Sedgwick. I knew and dated a man who was 14 years old when he met Andy Warhol and Edie Sedgwick, who, by the way, only had a 9-month relationship. So Edie and Andy Warhol were only involved together collaboratively for a period of 9 months. But if you look at all the footage, you would think it was a period of years. Before I get started, I want to thank everyone who's contributed to my super thanks. And recently, it's Barry S., who went to my website and did a recurring contribution, which I really appreciate. Because as I said on this platform, they keep 40%, the intermediary keeps roughly 10, and the content producer, like myself, and other content producers, everyone who has commercials on their platform in effort to continue their work, They only get, less than 50% of what is given. And I also want to thank Susan with a D. Now, there's a Susan or two Susans, by the way, who have been horrific trolls from like day one, who I'm sure were sent by the person who turned me into the SLAVE. But those Susans I have blocked. However, Susan D is somebody entirely different, and I want to thank her for her super thanks on this channel and everyone else who has participated in that. It's really it's heartwarming to know that, my work is appreciated and that you've gotten something from the information that I present to you. And so no one has talked about the fact that Edie Sedgwick may have, in fact, been, while she herself was allegedly she used to say this herself in her day, that she had been, let's call it, manhandled by her biological father. No one has ever discussed the possibility that she might have in turn done the same to someone else. For today, for the first time, am going to explain that, but I'm going to first go over some information about Edie herself. And I think everyone knows that she was born into a very wealthy family. Her family are blue bloods. They connect back to, let's say, Thomas Jefferson. One of her uncles, I think great uncle, sort of was the guy at the Atlantic. Those of you who follow me on Substack know that the Atlantic is a three-letter agency tool. And so this family has connections to the intelligence apparatus. I'm not saying that Edie Sedgwick was part of the intelligence apparatus, but she comes from a family that was very connected, and she certainly was someone who had all the advantages as a child. However, her father, Francis Minturn Sedgwick, born in 1904, who died in 1965, whose description is basically he was a rancher, he was a sculptor, he was a member of the historical Sedgwick family of Massachusetts. And her mother, Alice Delano DeForest, you've got a couple of really important names there. There's a lot to dig into when you look at Edie Sedgwick's family. She was the daughter of Henry Wheeler DeForest, the president and chairman of the board of the Southern Pacific Railroad. And so the family that she was born into was enormously wealthy, and they had a very high social status. She was born in meaning Edie was born in Santa Barbara, California. That's where she is currently buried. And at some point, I'm going to return to the place of her burial, because the man I dated, who met Edie when she was 14, eventually married someone, had children of his own, or at least had one daughter of his own, who he believed was the reincarnation of Edie, because she was born on the same day that Edie died. And when he met Andy Warhol's group, they were very much into the afterlife and being reincarnated, and he's never let that go. It's still something that he believes in. Um, so Edie's early life was really troubled. Apparently, she found her father doing something inappropriate with a young woman, after which her father then put her into an insane asylum. Okay. She was basically sent to two different psychiatric institutions when, in her younger years. She had an older sister who eventually wrote a book. And there was some information that, in fact, I'm going to share with you. Um, in fact, the other thing I want to say is that Edie was not a blonde. No, she was a brunette, and she dyed her hair, and eventually Andy Warhol started to get the wigs in the same color as her hair. So they became these platinum blondes. And Warhol later in an interview said that he did it because he wanted to be more like a girl like Edie. Now, Edie had an eating disorder. She had already been put on substances during her time in her younger years at the direction of her father. And so, although Warhol's world was indeed fueled by the, let's call it, substance scene and plenty of ORGIES with people who were also not of age, no one again has said anything about Edie Sedgwick until today. So that her sister, she had an older sister, 12 years older than her, uh, wrote a memoir. And she basically, in her this memoir, she, quote, investigated how her sister became a pop culture sensation, um, and talked about their cursed, troubled childhood, and with the goal of setting the record straight. So Edie pretty much exploded into the public eye when she first matched up with Andy, who she met at a party for Tennessee Williams in 1965. It was instant chemistry. Within the first few days that they had met, they filmed their first project together. It was an underground movie and it was called Vinyl. What I want to add to this is that Warhol also filmed the very first X-rated film ever produced. This was done before Deep Throat. So it was actually Warhol, who I believe, explained to you in a previous podcast, was a gift from your three-letter agency, and he was funded by the three-letter agency. So it's no surprise that one of the goals of the company was to destroy the family unit. And it's no surprise then that Warhol would have been the first person to produce an X-rated film. Although I wonder, I mean, did you know that he was the first person to produce an X-rated film? I don't know if you knew that, but if you did, I'd love to hear about it in the comments section. So she is referred to as a muse with a lot of energy uh, for him to help him create. However, their so-called friendship or partnership lasted 9 months. And however, during this time, the world was captivated by the it couple. Warhol was at the time the most famous and influential pop artist, and Sedgwick became the most sought after fashion influencer of her day. What she was known for wearing just tights and a sweater and wore, a lot of eye makeup, changed the color of her hair from a brunette to a blonde. And again, with Andy Warhol dyeing his hair the same color as Edie's, they would be somebody that you would look at when they entered a room. So she starred, meaning Edie, in 10 of his underground films, including Poor Little Rich Girl and Chelsea Girls. And I mean, the world of Andy Warhol is very similar to, let's say, that of the epi person, who in fact was a fixture at Andy Warhol's New York Academy of Art. Andy Warhol and Stuart Pivar founded the New York Academy of Art. And if you listen to the podcast I uploaded a few days ago on the odd painting of Bill Clinton that was painted by a student, a former student at the New York Academy of Art, Epstein sat on the board. I believe it was from 1987 to 1994, but it was, in fact, Warhol and his friend Pavar who co-founded the school. And the school has had, of course, a lot of controversy. We know that Maria Farmer, for example, was a student of the school, and it is there where she met Jeff. Now, what I want to say about Jeff's world is that it, like Andy Warhol's world, was a mixture of regular people and then a mixture of high society people who were involved in, let's say, I'm going to call it the dirty world, like a world full of debauchery, okay, that kind of thing, where there were no rules. Um, so the way that they were looked at is that they were, meaning Warhol and Edie, that they were opposites, that Warhol was funny looking, that he looked gay. He never really like did anything to look straight. He had really bad skin. He had these horrible silver wigs. He was pathologically shy. And before it was okay to be out of the closet, he was kind of a swishy kind of guy. He didn't hide what he was. Now, my theory about why he didn't hide who he was at a time when nobody was really out of the closet. There were a lot of gay bars in the city, meaning New York City, but everybody was in the closet. I believe that he didn't hide it because he was made popular by the three-letter agency who was beginning to tear down the barriers to try to make women obsolete, frankly. And that's a talk for another day. But however, Edie was the embodiment of everything that he wanted to be. He wanted to be very rich because he came from a poor background. This is very similar to, let's say, Jay-Z came from a very poor background. Sean Combs came from a poor background. And so you find these people like Warhol who are propelled into a very high position in the culture, and they're cultural conditioners, I'm going to call them, but they're not put there in a normal fashion. They do not grow on their own. There is help from levels above, if you catch my drift. So she died of an overdose at the age of 28. However, she continues to be a source of fascination. She's been memorialized in like thousands of magazine articles, books, and even a feature film starring Sienna Miller. And while her image is one of the most famous images on the planet, she's remained a mystery to those closest to her, including her eldest sister, Alice, whose last name is Wall, Wohl, although, her birth name was Sedgwick, obviously. And whether or not she's still alive, I don't know, but I know that when she was interviewed for her book, she was 91. But she said, her sister, if you picked up the world, turned it upside down, and shook it, you could not find two different people as Edie and me. So she, feels that she was completely different from her sister. And so the premise of her memoir, as it turns out, thinking about Edie and Andy, it's basically she was seeking to explore the enduring celebrity of her younger sister, who she once disregarded as being a vain, shallow, and spoiled child doing silly, meaningless things. And so she said that she had sort of missed when it was happening. She and her husband did not have a TV set. They were art historians. They lived in the country. She was aware that Edie had achieved some sort of fame, but it was the time of Vietnam War, of the civil rights movement, and that, as far as Andy Warhol, she just didn't see what was important about it. So she wasn't really tuned in during the time that Edie had her golden moment. And her golden moment wasn't so golden when you think about it. She was perpetually depressed. She was perpetually taking substances. She was perpetually objectified. And as I just said to you at the opening of this podcast, I have a friend who was 14 years old when he met and started hanging out with Edie and Andy and being taken, let's say, to these places where there were just open ORGIES. Now, there's a lot that has been said about Edie being depressed because the death of her two brothers, one of self-unalivement, another one who had a fatal motorcycle accident. But, her sister was in her 30s and a mother of two children, and she was preoccupied with her own life. So she really didn't have the time to pay attention to Edie and Andy. In fact, it wasn't until 2015 that Wall, her older sister, discovered Edie's precise birth date, and she only did that by flipping through a Vogue magazine headline that read, "Happy birthday, Edie Sedgwick." And then that's kind of when she realized, oh, well, gee, Edie was really famous. And so in her memoir, she chronicles a privileged childhood spent on a California ranch with dysfunctional parents who were unbelievably and horrifically mean. It's not unusual. We've heard about Robert Maxwell and his temper. He became very wealthy, but he was a very mean-spirited man. She goes on to add that in her family, nobody ever said a word about what was going on under the surface, that appearances were everything. And you see that time and time again in wealthy families where you just, you have this exterior. Look at Jackie Kennedy. She had this exterior of everything is perfect in her life, but in reality, nothing was perfect in her life. She was married to JFK, who was a philanderer, and perhaps more, right? Because we know that Marilyn Monroe did not unalive herself. And so in their life appearances were everything, and they lived by this rule. So they did have a tortured but privileged childhood on a cattle ranch in Santa Barbara. And in reality, however, she says that their father, Francis, who was called the Duke, was also known as Fuzzy to his children, was a notorious philanderer who was diagnosed with manic depressive psychosis before he married Wall's mother, who was a railroad heiress, Alice Delano DeForest, in 1929. So they got married at the same time that we were entering into the Great Depression. That's when they got married. He was advised by a psychiatrist to not have children. Instead, the couple had 8 children, and Edie was the one that would become the ill-fated, she calls it the ill-fated muse of Andy Warhol. She goes on to add, my father was outrageously narcissistic and dominating. Her memoir recalls how he was always nearly naked, and he did his daily exercises by the pool in nothing but a little white cotton loincloth. Edie once claimed that her father forced her and her sister Susanna to sit in a sphinx-like position with bare tops, let's just say, so they were nude from the waist up, on top of the columns flanking the entrance to their driveway. And Edie also told everyone that she was subjected to his advances beginning at the age of 7. And although her sister says that, she finds it hard to believe, doesn't mean that maybe it was true. She herself said that he was seductive and he had very shocking behavior. And she tells of her own experience of the night Fuzzy. Uh, Basically was telling her that she was getting engaged to a man that he felt was below her station. And at the end of the night, he put his arm around her, placed her head on his bare shoulder, and said, don't you think I understand how all these men feel about you? After all, I am a man too. And so she was like, my father is making a pass at me. And she thought, well, you filthy old creep. And she eventually later shared that with Airmail Weekly. And so Edie did spend her youth in and out of mental institutions before she was unalived of an overdose at the age of 28. And her brother Minty committed unalivement of his own after having himself a series of breakdowns. And he did that in 1964. And then their other brother fatally crashed his motorcycle into a bus a year later. And her father, Fuzzy, she keeps on saying, was really just a snob of the worst degree. His rich ancestry included Theodore Sedgwick, a Speaker of the House under Thomas Jefferson, an aunt who was the subject of a very famous John Singer Sargent portrait hanging in the Metropolitan Museum of New York. And his own father was a prolific historian that knew and didn't particularly like Henry James. So this family, they're as blue-blooded American as they come. And if you look really deeply into the blue-blooded Americans, they're just the most scandalous people that just very scandalous people. So I met the man who was in an inappropriate relationship with Edie Sedgwick at the age of 14. Um, I believe when I was working as an administrative assistant for a book publishing firm. And he was the son of my boss at the time and was very handsome, young guy. I did have a secret crush on him. I was very young at the time. He was approaching 30, and he was already married and with kids. However, what I didn't know, and then we reconnected later in life after he got a divorce. And I later discovered that he had adopted his wife's first daughter because he, who had been broken into this world of debauchery, um, it really, in his case, it really began, he's someone whose father was one of these men, like from, he worked in the advertising industry. So he was straight from the ad men situation, that 1960s advertising world. He is the son of that. And they are Irish. And as being Irish, you are connected to the church. And so his first experience was being subjected to inappropriate behavior by the priests who would intoxicate him and do inappropriate things with him. And that never left him. He has been haunted his entire life by that sort of behavior. And while he can see how it was inappropriate with the clergy, with the Catholic priests, I don't think he ever came to the same realization when it came to his behavior and what happened when the way I'll go back, and the way he told me that he got into the whole Warhol scene. And by the way, there were other teenagers there as well, which is never talked about, is he took a part-time job just to make, even though he came from a well-to-do family, he took a part-time job as a young teenager doing deliveries. And he began delivering liquor for a liquor store. And that's how he ended up delivering liquor to the church. And that's how he ended up delivering liquor to Andy Warhol. And I believe it was at the factory, the actual factory at the time. And we know from Andy Warhol's diary and a few documentaries that show how he met one of his younger loves, let's call it, is that this kid also was delivering stuff to the factory, and he too was very good looking. And he was offered a job sweeping and doing things, and eventually he became Andy's partner. But nothing is ever discussed about the young ones, like the 14-year-old that was my friend. We have since had a falling out. That's why I feel okay sharing this information with you, because I am no longer speaking with him. His inappropriate behavior sort of never stopped. Once your life is destroyed, it's destroyed. You do not know what the boundaries are. You lose all sense. Well, many people, I'm not saying everyone, but he in his life lost all sense of boundary. He never learned to regain that. And when I began to reconnect with him later on in life, I began to notice strange behavior towards me. And I was not someone that was okay with, because I was learning. By then I had begun to learn, I'm a survivor, and I had begun to learn what's an appropriate boundary for me to have in my own life. So I recognized the fact that he had no boundaries, and that was just not cool for me. I was not into being with somebody who had this. But during the time that he and I reconnected and spent time together, he shared all of this other stuff with me. He had a fascination for going back to the Chelsea Hotel to sort of recreate the life as he had experienced it with Edie and in the Warhol circle, at which time he shared all of this information with me. So I am probably the only person that has come forward to say that Edie Sedgwick has been immortalized into this almost Marilyn Monroe figure. We know how much of a painful life Monroe had. Well, and there are allegations that she too was having dalliances with people who were not necessarily of the age of consent. And while it has been publicly, somehow in the past, if a man did this to a female child or to a male child, it was never considered a good thing, but it was not really talked about because of the shame that it provoked. Nobody wanted to be somebody's victim. We are talking about it more now, but really until recently, if it was a male child with a female who was beautiful and powerful and famous, it was considered a plus for the boy. Well, not really anymore, right? We're now beginning to look at things objectively, and we can recognize that, hey, wait a minute. Just like we know that Epi's friend G, it was not innocent because she's now sitting in a jail cell. We can now recognize that what Edie Sedgwick did with this then 14-year-old boy was wrong. So to go again, he never forgot her. His daughter, his only real birth daughter, was born on the day that Edie died. And he, for until today, I'm sure, believes that Edie was reincarnated in his daughter, who, by the way, also unalived of the same thing, an overdose, and whom he buried next to Edie in Santa Monica because he feels that they are one and the same. Now, that's again not something you're going to hear anybody on any channel on this platform or anywhere else share with you. I am going to ask you to politely like this podcast so it can get some airtime. And again, I want to wish you all a very happy new year. And I am curious to hear what you have to say about this podcast. All right, guys, till the next time. Bye.